Hello Horror Hounds. After spending a ton of time mucking around with Pirates in the Caribbean and Lone Rangers, Gore Verbinski, director of The Ring, the American version of The Ring, returned to horror with A Cure for Wellness. And whilst Jack Sparrow might have been sad to see him go for a while, there's one thing that I know he would have approved of. The film is rated R. Now, there are a small group of horror films, let me try and explain this, made by legitimate directors, artistic directors, who seem to appropriate the horror genre, use it rather than luxuriate in it. I'm thinking of Darren Aronofsky in Black Swan, Martin Scorsese in Shutter Island, and I'm very conscious that the same also applies to Stanley Kubrick with The Shining, directors who want to use the trappings and apparel of the horror genre. They want to play in that sandbox for a little while, but they don't want to be seen to be slumming it. So what they create is something cerebral. The Shining's on the list, so it doesn't mean that those movies are necessarily bad. They're always very well made. They don't always necessarily feel like they're made for horror fans though, and A Cure for Wellness falls into that small little grouping very well for me. If you're a fan of horror movies, if you've seen lots of horror movies, nothing in this movie will surprise you, just like really nothing in Black Swan will surprise you, nothing in Shutter Island will surprise you. Kubrick's the only real exception, I feel. He took horror conventions and created his own horror conventions in The Shining that have since been taken on and used by others. Whereas a movie like A Cure for Wellness, magpies from lots of places. Dane DeHaan, perfectly cast here, plays a character called Lockhart. He's a sort of mid-level Wall Street broker, and he's sent by the board of directors of his company on a mission to a wellness spa in the heart of Europe to retrieve the CEO called Pembroke, who's gone there and appears to have lost his mind. Straight away, Lockhart is Captain Willard, sent up the river in Apocalypse Now to find the lost Colonel Kurtz. He's a modern-day Jonathan Harker, sent to the heart of Transylvania, the darks of Transylvania, to finalise a land deal with a certain Eastern European nobleman. And this is really what I mean by anyone who is familiar with the tropes and the conventions of horror movies and these kind of stories will be a couple of blocks ahead of the movie pretty much every step of the way. As soon as that illusion near the start of the movie drops and you overthink Apocalypse Now, or specifically Dracula, the references begin tumbling out of the screen. The film's part gothic horror, part body horror, part Hitchcockian mystery. It's got allusions to Shutter Island, the Prisoner TV series from the 60s, The Shining, the Silent Hill computer games, Hostel, Alice in Wonderland, Jacob's Ladder, the Dunwich Horror, H.P. Lovecraft, The Brood, The Phantom of the Opera. The film looks glorious. It looks gorgeous. Every shot is dripping with information that you want to take in, whether it's a packed frame or a frame full of negative space. You could pause the film at pretty much any juncture and study that frame, study that one still image. An awful lot of work has gone into the look and the feel of this movie. But beneath the surface, where's the heart? Watching it, I did seriously get the feeling that it was a horror movie for people who don't watch horror movies. And as a result, it was frantic to not lose anyone, to not have anyone lag behind. So every single point the film tries to make is so belaboured. Every reveal, I wouldn't even necessarily call them twists, because they're so signposted continually. Little coming back, the film keeps coming back to little breadcrumbs and go, oh, remember this, remember this. Like we weren't even 10 minutes into the film before someone I was watching it with said, Oh, so water's a major theme then, and it is. It doesn't want you to forget. Oh, remember the water, guys, everyone. Yes. Oh, drink the water. Oh, here's some more water. Remember the water, guys. Keep thinking water. Keep thinking water. It never trusts you to let anything settle in and settle down, so that when it circles back round and that theme or image becomes important, you can make the connections yourself. It's constantly referring you back to the things it wants you to remember. Oh, remember that story of the nobleman from a few hundred years ago who lived in the castle that got burnt down, that's now the clinic? Right, well, remember that story, guys. And oh no, about 20 minutes has gone past. We better have someone just bring back that story again about that nobleman, just to remind everyone that that's a thing that I want them to keep in mind. By the time the film ends, I want them to have that story in mind. And the water, I want them to think about the water. For a film that's presenting itself like an intellectual labyrinth, like a puzzle, playing with the ideas of what's real and what's not real, in a way that Jacob's Ladder does so well. I was thinking, well, I can't be so on this. I can't have wrapped my mind so completely around this that there isn't something coming later on. And there kind of isn't. Reading some of the online reviews, and especially the viewer reactions to it, it's certain that the film is divisive. Some people clearly think it's ponderous rubbish, while other people are convinced it's a misunderstood masterpiece. In that regard, it reminds me of The Neon Demon, which I reviewed a little while ago. But The Neon Demon, to its credit, has Nicholas Winding Refn's very dark, very dry, wry sense of humour behind it. I suspect that The Neon Demon is trolling the audience a little bit, and it always kind of has a wry smile on its face, whilst it's presenting a very serious "this is art." I think it's sniggering behind its hand quite a lot, whereas there doesn't seem to be a sense of humour behind A Cure for Wellness that acts as a release valve to it. It does seem to take itself incredibly seriously. It is amazingly po-faced, and unfortunately, beneath all of that, the water that it keeps referring back and back and back to just isn't very deep. One of the unfortunate side effects is we get a film that takes itself far too seriously and desperately wants to present itself as a piece of art, whereas what it is doing is alluding to B-movies from the 1940s and 50s, monster movies that in and of themselves never took themselves seriously and got in and out, sometimes in a little over an hour, never over 90 minutes, clipped along at a fair old pace and got the job done. Whereas A Cure for Wellness, which is paying homage to these movies, does the exact opposite in both those cases. It's not that I completely dislike the movie. The movie is less than the sum of its parts. Some of its parts are excellent. It just doesn't need to hang together in a movie this long and this serious. And I'm genuinely baffled as to why the movie takes itself so seriously. There's a clear love behind the makers of this movie for the classic Universal horror movies. That sense of love, though, doesn't seem to extend to the point where those movies are accepted for what they are. And instead, this seems to say, yeah, we love those movies, but we know they're silly. So we're going to take elements of those movies and we're going to do it properly for you in a proper movie. No. You're missing the heart and soul. If you leave out the silliness, you leave out the purpose. I must say, though, for a movie that seems to be put together so intellectually rather than emotionally, I did engage with it much more on an intellectual level. And maybe that's a sign of how I wasn't pulled into the movie, that I was watching it as an analytical exercise. But there is a sense that this movie is a sort of Alice-like fall down a rabbit hole of Western cinema. And the further into the film you go, the further back through time you go. It starts with possibly even an 80s Wall Street-like corporate drama, if not up to the 21st century with something like Margin Call, and then sort of lazily, slowly tumbles back through a 60s conspiracy, through to a 1950s post-war spy movie, all the way back to the 30s and the classic horror movies, practically ending slap dab in 1925 with Universal's Phantom of the Opera starring Lon Chaney. The trouble is, it seems content just to do that. It never puts itself over the top. It never goes just the extra mile into something truly cosmic and Lovecraftian that it seems to be dallying with and playing with all around the edges. It's definitely a movie I'll return to. Maybe I'll have warmed to it in 2 or 3 years' time. Certainly this is my honest reaction to the movie as I've seen it now, but we all know that my reaction isn't worth one eel in a bucket of many being force-fed down Dane DeHaan's throat. So I like to try and round off these videos with alternate viewpoints taken from Internet Movie Database user reviews. The first one is from Mike's ID Has Been Taken, and he's really broken the code here in a review that he's entitled Stupid. This is such a stupid movie, which is what makes it so enjoyable. The second half of the movie is going to split opinion, from those that wanted a serious psychological thriller drama that delves into the depths of the subconsciousness and blah 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 blah, and those that wanted this. What's great about this movie is that for the first half of it, I didn't realise I was watching a stupid movie. I thought it was serious, and then when it changes, well, some people might not like it. They might feel conned that they were watching something that was so serious 1 minute and then the next ... Personally, I liked it. Just be warned, it's more of a ridiculous gothic horror movie than you might think from the trailer. Whereas Josh Landberg, fighting the system and raging against the machine, says in a review entitled, "Everyone who lives and works in Manhattan should be forced to watch this film. Certainly the best film I've seen in 2017. Amazing sets, costumes and decor. This gets into the deepest parts of the realities we create for ourselves. Do yourselves a favour, put down your mobile and watch this film. Pay close attention to the allegory, set and setting. The only conclusion is the inevitable destruction of the corporate world."